Hey there guys, this is Obsidian Chill. Got another video for you today. Welcome to the continuation of my in-depth updated guide series. We're on to light. As usual, the pinned comment is going to have a breakdown of each of the timestamps to the relevant information in this guide. So if you're looking for just the single target rotation for might or for precision or for a controller loadout, for melee, range, whichever, you'll find those timestamp in the comments. So you can skip right to the relevant section of this guide. As usual, this guide series is only going to have the updated relevant information, so I'll be changing all the rotations, anything to do with trinkets, supercharges, stuff like that. That's what I'll be talking about here. This won't have any raid footage, just because I'm trying to keep this guide series under realistic length. And then I'll also have a link to my previous guide that I did back in 2018 for light, which will go into a little bit more in depth with supercharge testing and such. Because even though that's an older video, a lot of the information hasn't changed. Light hasn't changed in the past year. Rotations have just slightly changed about what's current and what's valid. But in terms of testing and which powers work which way, that hasn't changed since the previous guide. So let's kind of get into it here. Okay, so to get into the DPS spec for light, I do want to say at the beginning of the video here, I'm not going to be doing a precision spec side to this guide for light, because it doesn't make sense from a couple different levels. For one, the reason why you go light might is so that you can compete with prec DPS and prec damage while being a might based DPS. So if you don't want a prec DPS, you don't want a weapon DPS, you go light or celestial, like powers like that can compete with prec, because that's the whole point of them. The other side of it is that why would you go precision light when the whole point of light is to be able to use the lantern abilities and contract powers and having this wide range of animations and such. That's why you go light. You go light because you like lantern powers, you like using construct abilities, which you wouldn't be able to use as prec. And there's no secret light prec rotation. It's just the same, super speed abilities, flurry shot, clip with tornado pull. Like there's no light rotation out there for prec. It's just going to be the standard rotation. So on a fundamental standpoint, there's no point to being light prec. If you want to prec DPS, go rage or gadgets or any other kind of power out there. Don't go light, because light is the whole point not to go prec. So let's kind of get into the DPS spec here for might, which is what matters. So it's going to be super spider spec, critical attack chance, critical attack damage. You put the rest into might and power, and then put the other skill points into health, because light is going to be a melee and mid-range based power, so you want that for survivability, or if you're running the Tetra. Iconic powers, you need Robot Sidekick, Sonic Cry if you're not going to be super speed, because you got a couple options there. If you're super speed, don't worry about this, but if you're skimming or acro or flight, you're going to need super speed. Neo Venom Boost obviously as well. For super speed, like I said before, light, like other abilities and like other powers, light greatly benefits from being super speed and greatly benefits from it. It does really well with Dervish, really well with tornado pull and single target. You don't necessarily have to be. I'm going to show you both rotations. I'm just saying that it greatly benefits from being super speed if you care about your damage, but you can still do the rotations with acro, flight, or skimming, which I'll show both here. But if you're obviously going to be super speed, you're going to be taking speed drain and dervish. In terms of weapons, whatever weapon you spec, you just need to put one in there just to get at the proficiency. Don't worry about that. So in terms of gear, with your weapon, you're going to have blast adapter in that mod. Head mod is going to be supercharged Neo Venom Boost 3. Neck mod is going to be escalating might. The back mod, there's no real back mod that benefits light in terms of the custom ones, because of the the high chance you're always going to be in melee or mid range. I just take Berserker for a bit of extra damage, just because you're going to be constantly in that range. Chest mod, penetrating strikes. Core strength could be there too. It's just hard to test. I've seen more people run penetrating strikes. I've had more success running penetrating strikes. Could be core strength. It's just that sometimes they're broken, sometimes they're not broken. It's just incredibly hard to test to get an accurate result. Legs are going to be restorative hand clap. Once again, the healing from this doesn't really scale, so you don't have to really worry about it. In terms of utility belt, you got some options depending on what you're doing. Since this is a melee rotation, you want the summer event trinket, because that's going to be the highest damage you can get from a single trinket for melee range. If you're going to be using like mid-range or something, then you could use the Shadow Bat, the Seahorse. You got other options. DBS trinket, orbital, and supply drop. Hand mods is going to be max damage, and the foot mod, if you're super speed, you're going to want the dashing combos because we're going to be canceling dervish with that. If you're flight, skimming, or aggro, just go tumbling mastery, doesn't really matter, or preference. Now, in terms of artifacts, this is where light will differ. So in the melee rotation, you're going to want Neovenom boost because it's going to revolve around using alternating between 2 supercharges to get the supercharge spam for the Eye of the Gemini to get the 5%, and well as the proc the Pollux Gaze. You're going to want the Granorum because you need to set up days for hard light, and it saves you running in trap or chompers. And then the third artifact, this is where you have an option. Hard light doesn't use heat vision, so there's no point. The only point to run this is because you want the highest might you can get as light, because that's where it benefits from. So you could run the Tetra, you could run this. Like obviously, if I had the Philosopher's Stone at 200, I would run the Philosopher's Stone at 200 because then you get the benefits of the supply drop. Because the only reason we're running Soul Amplifier here is because I have it leveled at 160, so I get the 5% might and the 890 base might. But if I had the stone leveled, I would use that. You could also run the Tetra, so it's up to you. So you have to run the Gemini, you have to run the Granorum. The third artifact is kind of your choice. If you've got the stone leveled and you spend the money on that, go for it. If not, use a Soul Amplifier because most likely you already have it compared to other power sets that use heat vision. Or you can run the Tetra. It's completely up to you for that third one. But the main focus of light is to get your might as high as possible. Okay, so what is clipping? That's going to be a term that's going to be used throughout this guide. Light is one of the last remaining power sets, along with Celestial, a few others, that there's actually true clipping involved with, or think of a clipping as animation canceling for, but lack of a better terminology. Clipping has drastically changed from the beginning of the game, nerfed down to a bare minimum, but it's still present in power sets. And light is one that it is very present, and you do need to clip to be able to excel with light. So what I mean by that is, so we look at Grasping Hand. The tap range on Grasping Hand is fan. So if I do Grasping Hand and tap range, there's fan. So you can kind of see it's out for 1.5 seconds, something like that. So the fan construct can be clipped instantly and the damage will still register. So that's what I mean by that. So if we go to the sparring target, Grasping Hand and fan, you just saw a fan right there. What's the Grasping Hand dot stock? Fan damage sparring target for 3,923. So now this time, pay attention. So Grasping Hand, done. So you don't see the fan animation at all, but if you go back up to here, right there, once it stops, fan damage sparring target for 3,971. So the damage still registers from fan, even though I'm clipping it instantly. You didn't see that fan animation, so I'll do it again here. So Grasping Hand, tap range, done. So as we kind of go up here again, once it stops, fan critically damaged sparring target for 8,604. So you didn't see fan. The animation was hardly there. It was out for maybe a fraction of a second, but the damage still registers. So that's the main point here. You don't need to wait for the animation to be able to see the animation for it to register. Obviously, you can't do it too early, but very rarely will that happen. So another example will be with whips here. So if I go and do Whip Thrash, so this will be another common one you'll see in the guide here. So Whip Thrash, the tap melee on Whip Thrash is Whip Thrash again. So if I just don't clip, so whips and whips again, obviously you can see how long that takes. But if we do whips and then clip the construct of it, just like we did with the fan, so we got whips and boom. So you can see obviously Whip Thrash still hit for everything. I'm using hand clap just so it doesn't set up dots or anything like that. So whips again, done. So the entire Whip Thrash animation, like you saw this here, all that damage applies, but I'm clipping the animation. Even that was a bit slow. So we'll just do it again. So I'm still getting all the damage, but I'm clipping the construct. So basically it just saves time. I don't need to do that entire duration where I can clip it. Same thing, another example here will be with the range rotation. You'll see, go into RAM. So RAM, the tap range is fan. This is kind of the main staple to the range rotation. So if I do RAM and then fan. Same thing. You saw a fan for, was that probably 2 seconds or something like that? That it was out. 1, 2. But you can clip that once again, just like the other one. So if I do ram and ram again, so you'll see I'm still getting the damage from fan damage, sparking target, fan damage, sparking target, fan, and then on my ram again. So we can do it again. You know, ram, ram. And there's all the fan hits. So you don't see my actual fan animation out because I'm clipping the construct. So as soon as you do fan, as long as you're basically tapping towards that next command, like as long as you do, because if I do ram and then just do ram again, like it's not going to work. Because like if I don't actually tap range, so if I do sorry, those whips. So if I do ram and then ram, obviously I didn't tap range at all. So I'm not going to get any damage from fan because I didn't tap range. So you have to make sure you're actually tapping range to trigger that construct. So ram, tap range, now it's fan out. So range, make sure I'm tapping. So I'll still get fan because I was tapping range. Up there. So there's fan. So as long as you trigger the next construct in order, same way it would work with Celestial. So as long as I'm tapping range to trigger fan, as long as I'm tapping melee to trigger the whips construct, as long as I'm tapping range to trigger fan. With hand clap, it's just basically the third hand clap. So if I go back to hand clap, that's another common one you'll see with the light single target. So 1, 2, and 3. So you don't need to do that third one. It's a waste of time. So 1, 2, and then grasping hand. So you saw the hand clap animation, obviously, but I'm in the middle of grasping hand when it applies. So instead of 1, 2, 3, you're only going to see 1, 2, and boom. So that was number 3, but you're already started your next power. So you can kind of get a sense of how much damage you're actually progressing and how faster you're doing the rotation, because you're saving the entire animation from doing that construct, starting the next power in the damage cycle. So it's one of those things where it's like, yeah, I can show you like this and I can talk about it, but it's one of those things where you have to get used to on a mouse or keyboard or on a gamepad or your PS controller, Xbox controller, whichever medium you're using. You just have to make sure that you're not using that animation, because it's a waste of time. It's a damage loss. I don't need to tap range and see the fan animation. Like I don't need to do like ram, tap fan, then into ram, tap fan into the ram. Like I don't need to be doing that. That's way too slow. It's you're wasting time that you could be doing DPSing, because it should just look like you're still getting all their fans. If I scroll up, I'm still getting all the fan damage. You're just not seeing it. So you're saving time. You're increasing your DPSing just by clipping. It's just something that works obviously a lot better with light, because it doesn't really apply to a lot of other power sets. But same thing if you're rage. If you're doing like outrage times 3, you're not going to just sit and watch you slam outrage down. You're going to clip it into your next power, clip it into lacerate, because it's just a waste of time. You're wasting animation time that you could be using to progress your rotation to do more damage. So hopefully that kind of makes a little bit more sense. These concepts are going to come out and through this guide, especially like the melee rotation is going to use the whips clip. The range rotation is going to use the ram clip. The single target rotation is going to use a grasping hand and hand clap clip. So it's not so much clipping. You're clipping the construct. You're basically canceling the animation of the construct and clipping that into the next power or next ability. So have any questions about clipping in general, put that in the comment section below, but hopefully this kind of gives you an idea, and you can kind of use this to progress through the rest of the guide and follow along with it. So good luck. So in terms of a loadout for light, for melee range, once again, it's going to differ. There's going to be 2 variations, one if you're super speed, one if you're not. So we'll show both. So this is going to be the super speed variant. It's going to be whips. And then we're using the tap melee for whip thrash for the construct, dervish, and lightweight, and then robust sidekick. And the reason why I'm running 2 supercharges here is because, for one, you're only using 3 powers as light, and 2, you can use Pollux's Gaze to alternate supercharges between them. So obviously this will help if you have like healers or tanks in your group using Gemini to use Caster's Watch to regen, but it still works on the same principle where you're alternating between supercharges to make sure you always have that buff to help push yourself over the top, because light has bad supercharges. Strafing Run is a bad supercharge for 10,000, does lower damage. The dot ticks for like 20 seconds, so it's outside of the Eye of the Gemini damage radius. Whereas the Ballistic Assault is a good damage supercharge for a 5,000, but you're stuck in the animation the entire time, so it's completely useless because it doesn't do enough damage to warrant you not doing any other damage besides Ballistic Assault. Like if you could just clip out of that and the helicopter would still show up and do attack, that'd be great, but it doesn't, so that's the issue. So it's just your Revolving Run Neovenom and Speed Drain. You don't have to be using Speed Drain. You could use Vacuum Bubble. You could use Pheromone Bloom and the iconic supercharges right here. If you're not super speed, it just has to be a 25%er. Pheromone Bloom does some nice burst damage. Vacuum Bubble does a little bit of burst, but it's conic, so it's really annoying. Devastating Flip can work, but then you have to be in that certain range to be able to use it, and it will knock you backwards. So Speed Drain's ideal because it's just the dot damage, but Pheromone Bloom will work just as well. You just want a 25% super. So the concept is when you have a bunch of ads coming, like big group of ads, jump in, use Neovenom Boost, start your rotation so you get the max potential out of your Gemini, and then after Neovenom Boost, Gemini is done after 6 seconds, then you hit Speed Drain. Oop. And then it basically continues on that buff. So basically it makes you consistently have that Pollux's Gaze. If we go back to it, so you consistently have that Pollux Gaze, you get the 20% of extra damage, so all the DPS around you. So all the Prec DPS, Doom Spinning, the Rage Might DPS, whatever have you, in the group, you can consistently keep Neovenom and 25% or up and active, so you can maintain that buff throughout the entire group. So it doesn't matter if they popped like a Berserker or Cursed Idol, something like that, like a high hitting supercharge. You can basically leech off that and keep your buff running with that. So basically, even though your supercharges aren't dealing a lot of damage, your melee rotation is making up that damage, and you're just consistently having that 5% buff as well as the damage from Pollux's Gaze. So I know that sounds confusing, but it's basically you just have the options to run 2 supercharges, so you're just alternating between them. So for those big moments where there's a bunch of ads, obviously the main damage will be from Neovenom Boost, and then Speed Drain is just supplemental. It's like you don't think of the Speed Drain as damage, it's just Speed Drain, and the 25%er is being used to extend your Eye of the Gemini buff, where your main damage is going to come from using Neovenom Boost. So it's a bit more practical when there's supercharged feeders in the group, like a Nature DPS, like Nature Bug Healing, or Celestials using it, whichever have you, tanks using it. But they're pretty prevalent in groups. Not so much more for your average pug group, but that's where you want to be, like in more league runs, fen runs, stuff like that. So it's how you take advantage of having an extra ability. So going into the second spec, basically it's the exact same. You're just dropping Dervish and taking Entrap. So not only does Entrap set up the Daze PI, so if you're not running the Grim at 160 to get the AoE, or 160 or 200, you have Entrap setting up the PI, and then because Entrap's cooldown is 1.5 seconds, you can use that to clip whips and continue on your rotation. The one thing to want to mention is that Entrap does encase. So if your Dom is above 1500 on sparring targets, you'll encase your targets and send them flying, so obviously that's not ideal. Or if you're in content, like lower content, like open world, solos, stuff like that, even some duos, where the ads have 0 willpower, you'll encase them as well, so that can be a bit annoying. So then worst case scenario, if that's super annoying you can run Chompers, same kind of cooldown. Obviously it's going to be lower damage, because Entrap crits about the same as Sonic Cry, so once again, if you don't want to send the ads flying, you can use Chompers or Sonic Cry. The rotation gets a little bit awkward because Sonic Cry is 3 seconds. So it extends a little bit less, but in terms of damage, Entrap can crit the same, but it's got a bit lower of a cooldown, a little bit higher power cost as well, but it just makes up for that damage. So we'll show both in the rotations, but this is your non-supercharged loadout. Same thing, you just use Pheromone Bloom, whatever. So if you want like a pure one, we could go back into it here, because I think it's a good point spec. So if you want officially that non-super speed loadout, you just use Entrap and Pheromone Bloom. So this would be your non-supercharge, non-super speed loadout, and then obviously if you're super speed, you can run Speed Drain and Dervish. Okay, so let's kind of get into the rotation here to kind of show you what I mean by the differences between super speed and a regular non-super speed rotation. Alright, so once again, power intensive rotation at the end. Let's drop down to 50k. That was just because I was out of power. But it gives you an idea there. So even at 50k might, which is not that much might comparatively, if I would have had the stone at 200 or the grim at 200, most DPS I know are rocking like 52, 53k might. I don't have the OP neck either. So, you know, almost pushing 60k parsers, 58, 58, 51, depending on the crits and how many targets are in there. But it's still a very powerful might rotation for melee, very reasonable. Now, in terms of rotation timing, usually it's about 1 second you wait for whips to be up. So if you do whips, you go into dervish, then you have to tap dervish to do the dashing combos. So if I go to my foot mod here, dashing combos, you've seen that in previous my guides as well. So if I do dervish and tap melee, you see that it just cancels it like that. Now, technically, you can weapon tap cancel, but it's less damage because the dashing combos is melee, and can also crit as well. So rolling dervish, tap melee, doing dashing combos. Rolling dervish, tap melee, dashing combos. That's what you're using to cancel dervish with. And then usually you go back into you cancel lightweight by just doing the tap range on it into lightweight. And then essentially all you're doing is waiting about a second. So you do whips into dervish, whips is back up after 7, go back into dervish, tap, whips, dervish, wait about a second, then go into lightweight, throw. And then that's a 62k parse there, just by as an example. So it's waiting. You'll see the whip because your primary damage with this rotation will come from whips and the construct whips. So whip thrash, that's where your primary source of damage is. So usually you're waiting about a second. Once the cooldown you see whips to come back up, wait about a second. Then you're canceling dervish with dashing combos, and then you're canceling lightweight with the tap range on lightweight to go back into whip. So that's the time you got to watch for. Just like I did it right there. 62k parse, 25k or 25% crit chance. That's a very solid parser. Considering I'm at 50k might, which is not even near the max. I'm not even buffed, so that's why light can compete with prec, because if I'm in a raid buffed on might, or with my might augments and having the 3% might and power, that 62k parse turns into like 72, 80k parse easily in a raid under like Omega, under a Nitro, under a Tetra buff from the controller. So there's plenty of opportunities to buff a might DPS, and with light having a base 60, over 60k parse, with not even the highest might out there, because I think there's like 400 or 500 might in the neck. My artifacts aren't 200. The Gemini has 0 base. So it's very high damage with very realistic rotation. It's just that you have to get on the right timing. So you just have to make sure that obviously you're not doing double whips, letting that come out. You're not canceling dervish too early. You're not weapon canceling dervish, because like here, dashing combos like that. But if I weapon tap canceled it, all I'm getting is the one weapon tick from two-handed or the blast adapter proc. So it's not as ideal. And then lightweight, same thing. You can cancel lightweight by tapping weapon, but then you're not getting any extra damage from it. So lightweight tap range, that's when it throws, and you saw the 10k crit from it. So it's just making sure that you follow the proper light rotation constructs. So I'm always tapping melee to do the whip rash constructs. I'm just always canceling it going straight into dervish, and I'm always canceling dervish with dashing combos, and I'm always going from whips into lightweight and then canceling lightweight with the tap range construct of lightweight. So it's a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes to get that 62k damage. It's just that you have to be mindful, practice, make sure that you're not missing anything and missing it in the rotation. Or you just use the next rotation that I'll get into here if you're not super speed. So I'll show you both here. So let's kind of get into the next one. Okay, so that'll be the non-super speed one. Where we started here, 48, 55, 53, 52, 48. Obviously dip it back and then the power. So it's not that the power is excessive. It's just, once again, it's like the be consistent. So if you have power over time in the group or power generation from an alert that has rollers buff, you're fine. It's not that power intensive. Or you can just slow down the clips and get some power as well. But it's still, for the rotation, not having access to dervish still does well. Once again, just watch the encasement on entrap if your dom is over 1500 or the adds have 0 power. And then basically with this rotation, same thing with the other one, with the main one as well. You're still alternating between either Gemini so that you can keep it consistent. So for an example, if I was going to do this here, so say we're going to start an ad group, then I'd do basically, we could do Neovenom here. Yeah, and as we go. So that's basically the idea there. So you're alternating between both. Say if you had a super speed feeder, I could already use Pheromone Bloom once it was off cooldown, then or Neovenom again. So it's just keeping your parses consistent with all the other DPS around you. You'd have the extra 20% as well, just for melee range. Either Gemini is not that good for single target, but it's still great for the melee range, being able to have that damage. Okay, so I wanted to touch on this as well in this guide. I kind of briefly touched on it in my previous guide, but the reason why I don't talk about and I don't use chainsaw is I know there's going to be tons of people in the comment section saying, oh, I parse, 70, 80k, 100k, I parsed 900,000 damage with chainsaw. Chainsaw parses well because you're just hitting sparring targets that don't move and don't stun you and don't hit back. Chainsaw is the least practical power you can use as hard light. Like, you can just sit on the sparring targets and hit chainsaw and do good damage. Like, I've got no other powers, just the Daze PI and chainsaw, and like no robot sidekick, no nothing, no whips, and I'm still getting a 50k parse. Chainsaw does good damage on a sparring target, just does not do damage in alerts or in content. There are plenty of other hard light DPS that share this opinion with me, that have done tests themselves with, running a whips rotation versus a chainsaw rotation, and the chainsaw rotation gets absolutely destroyed. It's just something that even last time I tried to use a strictly chainsaw rotation, but you just, like, a small breeze will knock you out of it. The adds consistently move. You're slow to move. You're slow to clip because you're in the. You can't just use a couple chainsaw and clip out of it. You have to use the full, 5 times chainsaw to get actual decent damage. So it's not like whips where you can just, be out of it, in and out of it every couple of seconds and get all your damage, burst damage from that. It's slower damage. You're dependent on crits, because if it's a low, like if nothing crits, then you're not getting good parse. You have to get it all to crit, and you have to use it consistently. So it's not a practical power, and there's been plenty of discussion about it. So it's just not necessary to have it in the comment section, because we know you could have some super high parsing rotation with chainsaw. That's not going to be deniable. But once you get it actually in a raid or an elite raid, then your damage just skyrockets down. Just nosedives, because of it not being practical, because of the damage loss associated with using chainsaw in a raid versus like a whips, dervish, and lightweight rotation. So for light single target, it is one of the power sets that actually excel greatly in single target damage in terms of might DPS. It's one of the ones that can certainly compete with and exceed precision DPS depending on the power set. Light, it is also one of the only power sets that you don't require heat vision, and this is going to be one of the ones where people are going to be differing in the comments, or different opinions. But when you look at power sets that not needing heat vision, really two stand out, and that's going to be Celestial and Light. And that is a big change from my previous Light video, which I did have heat vision, but I was going about the rotation in the wrong manner. So with heat vision, you can still do, it's not like heat vision is bad with light. You can still do similar numbers, but the thing is, with amplified heat vision with the soul amplifier, for it to actually do well, you need to have it each critical. Like, you need the hits on heat vision to actually crit, and if you don't do that, then it can be lesser damage. The other thing as well is, I know it doesn't work in my case because I don't have the stone leveled, but if you have the philosopher stone leveled, like 160 or 200, you can run that as light instead of the soul amplifier. You need either the stone or the solar, just because they have the highest base might and the 5% might and the highest actual base might on them. But if you don't run the heat vision, which you don't need to as light necessarily, you can drop the soul amplifier and run the stone. You still get the same amount of might, but you also get the benefits of the stone. I don't have that because I wasn't going to sink in $250 just to an artifact, because my stone is at 0. I can hold off until like another sale or Christmas sale or something like that comes up. I'm not in that much of a hurry for it, but ideally you'd want to have the Gnorum for single target. You want to have the Gnorum, the stone, and then the Scrap of Soul Cloak, because Gemini is not that good on single target. That's more for AoE and for melee range, but you do a much better job with these. I know Dead King can also be very helpful. It's just that since lights scale so well with might damage, so with hand clap, with grasping hand, you want to stack as much might as you can. So you could even run Gnorum, stone, and Tetra if you wanted. I'm not a personal fan of running the Tetra's DPS because I don't want to buff the other DPS. If I run the Tetra, that means another DPS can use 4 artifacts, and I can only use 3. And plus, controllers can run them now. So that's more just like a personal preference that I don't want to run the Tetra. That's just the DPS in me. But once again, you can run that. Like, Hard Light benefits from running as much might as you can. So you don't necessarily need the Scrap of Soul Cloak, especially if you have healers or tanks feeding you supercharge. But ideally, you wouldn't necessarily need it. So in terms of loadout with not running heat vision, this is also going to differ slightly because depending on what mover you are. So right now I'm super speed, so I can run Tornado Pull clip with Inspiration, which is just the weapon buff. You're just clipping it because the animation time when Tornado Pull is long. And then you go into Grasping Hand, and then the Construct, which is hold melee, Grasping Hand Pull, clipping that with Hand Clap, and then going into Hand Clap tap range times 2. And then going back into Grasping Hand, just basically repeating the rotation with Psychic out and with Neo Venom Boost. And the most important thing in this rotation is that since you have the GNORM, you have the Days PI. So if you don't have the GNORM at least, or the GNORM, if you don't have that at least at 120, then you need to run a different loadout, which would be Chompers or Entrap to set up that Days PI. Entrap's pretty good. I don't mind Chompers for the dot, but and also Entrap's a 300 power cost. You'd be doing a 300 power cost with a 300 power cost. So that's kind of like really power chunky. But Chompers does the same thing. It's only 100 power cost. It just will do slightly lower damage because it's dot versus Entrap, which is basically burst damage. But say if your super speed, run tornado pull, clip with inspiration. If your acrobats, use zip tie attack, clip with inspiration. If your flight or skimming, just use Chompers. If you don't have the GNORM at 120 or 160 or 200, then run Chompers or Entrap. Those are your three options here. Everything else will stay the same. You don't need, because you're basically just clipping this, just running it here. So that's where the rotation stays at. And this only variation is going to be what you are. So like I said before, super speed, tornado pull, acrobats will have zip tie attack, and everything else will either run Chompers or Entrap. And if we kind of jump over here, so it's what I mean by, like I showed you what I mean by the clipping, same thing. So we're going to be doing grasping hand pull. So instead of doing that whole pull animation, I can stop it halfway and go into hand clap. And same thing. So instead, you saw the hand clap times 3. Like I don't have to sit here and do 3 hand claps. I can go grasping hand pull, clip that with hand clap, and I just clip the third one, and you go on your rotation. So that is the 2 clips you have to know for the single target rotation. It's just that basically I'm clipping grasping hand pull, which is the hold melee or hold melee. And then hand clap, I am clipping the tap range on the second one. So basically, if you see the hand clap animation by when you're doing grasping hand, you know you did it correctly, but it's kind of hard to screw up anyway, regardless. But everything else is just doing the actual clip there. So that's kind of the rotation and show you what it can do. Okay, well, you certainly get the idea there. Light is always very power intensive. You're not going to avoid that. It'll help if you have the Grim at 200 because then Robot Sidekick doesn't drain power. But obviously that's a lot of artifact to level just for that. But obviously in a raid doesn't matter because you're going to have a controller. And the first parcel will always be a little bit lower, like the 24k, because days is unapplied. So you got 33, 29, 29. When I restarted again, 24 is a bit lower because obviously the crit chance is 12, and I didn't have the days PI. But then I had a proper parcel at 37, so 37.2, and that's as a might DPS. So 37k is might DPS unbuffed, and like I don't have, compared to what other might DPS have, they're running like 53, 54k might because they have their artifacts at 200. So I'm still missing like a couple thousand compared to them. Plus I don't have the OP neck at all. Don't have that yet. But I'm still pulling out like 33, even a 37k parse at 20% crit chance. So light certainly has massive potential, and it's certainly definitely rocking that single target damage, that's for sure. And once again, without heat vision. So you have the crit. Obviously, this is going to be using, like I said, Tornado Pole, which will have the highest base crit chance of any single target ability. But Zip Tie attack's not too far behind. Your parsers, yeah, you're going to drop if you're flight or skimming, just because you'd be using chompers, or if you get the using trap, the crit for that. But if you're running with adds that are 0 willpower, then you're going to encase them within traps, so it's not ideal. But in a raid, that wouldn't matter. So obviously super speed is going to have the highest potential, but there are other options with all the other power sets. But as you can see, light and super speed, same thing with the melee rotation, just works really well together. And these are the results you can get. Yeah, easily 30k or above 30k parsers, completely unbuffed. So when it comes to range DPS as light, it's kind of funny because it's only 1 power. The entire ranged DPS of light is just 1 power. So it gets kind of super boring because you're just using that 1 power. And that's Ram. Because Ram you either has the tap range, which will be fan for the max ranged, or it'll be the tap melee, which will be whips. And with that one, whips isn't max range, that's more mid-range. So it comes down to most content nowadays you don't need to be max range for. Obviously, there's some going to be out there, but there's enough content where even if you can't melee, even if you can't melee, you're still going to be able to do mid-range damage. Mid-range damage would be like EMP range, everything else. So yeah, there's be plenty of cases where you can't melee because you'll die, or the adds have too much splash damage, or you're not geared enough, but you can still mid-range. And that's where light actually does really well, because you can just spam ram whips, ram whips, ram whips. Keep doing that over and over again, which I'll show in the rotation. But if you can't, then you have to do ram fan, and you're just spamming that. To fill the rotation or fill the loadout, because you still have to make up 5 powers. Robot Sidekick, I have chompers except the PI, and adds a little dot. You also get the inspiration clip, so it's not too bad. You don't necessarily have to do that. If you don't have the Granorum at 160, you're 100% going to have to do that, because that will apply the day's PI at range and AoE. So if you have it at 120, that's single target. 160 and 200 is AoE. So if you don't have that, then you must run chompers regardless. You could also run in trap too, but same thing. If adds are 0 willpower, and trap's going to encase them and knock them around. It's also 300 power cost clip, so that's a 600 power cost move. So 18,000 power at once. Isn't the best idea sometimes, depending on your loadouts, especially because you're going to be spamming ram, which is a 200 power cost consistently. So it is still a very power heavy rotation, even though you're using construct damage. And then the same as the melee rotation, I'm using double supercharges to speed drain and Neovan boost, coupled with the Gemini, ideally at 200, just to give you the extra boost and to help with the AoE damage as well. And the same thing with the Soul Amplifier. You could run the stone if you want. You could run the Soul Amplifier. Just depends what you have. I don't have the stone leveled. If you have the stone at 200, definitely use that, because obviously I'm not using heat vision for anything. And obviously then you could take the advantage of running the stone for the supply drop benefits. But that's really what you do, because there's really nothing else. Like, you can technically use Freezing Breath. I messed around with it. You kind of get some consistent numbers, but it entirely depends on whether or not the first 2 ticks of Freezing Breath crits. If it doesn't crit, then you're like a low parser, so there's no point. You might as well just unram spam. But if Freezing Breath, the couple ticks first crit, then you're fine. You're sitting at a good parse. But that's all it is. So if you really don't want to spam it, yeah, you can mix in Freezing Breath, because that's max range. Sonic Shout is not max range. That's mid range, so don't use that. You might as well, if you're going to use Sonic Shout, you might as well just do ram whip spam. Freezing Breath is the only max range alternative that you have, just in case you want to because if you don't have obviously if you don't have Gemini, it's pointless to run 2 supercharges, because there's no point. So then you'd have another free power, and you can mix in Freezing Breath. But in terms of the rotation, we'll get into that here, and it's going to be kind of super boring. It's either going to be ram fan or going to be ram whips. So let's kind of show you it anyways. So for the max range rotation, sitting at around 37, 37, 37, 37. That's just terrible crit percentage. I think I'd restart the soda as well. So obviously nothing to write home about, but max range light is not where you want to be at. You want to be closer to mid-range so you can use whips. So let's kind of get into that rotation here. Okay, so you get the idea there. 47, 43, 43, 46. Obviously very power intensive because you're spamming that 2 in power cost. It's a rotation that's more practical in content, just because you don't need a lot of power to maintain 2 in a power cost spam. You just need consistent power. So like a power over time, something from a controller, regen from an alert without a control, like a rollless buff. So it's not... it may seem a little bit hectic because I'm just doing myself. I have the regen from Robot Psychic nerfing me. So doing it yourself, yes, you can only do like, maybe 30 seconds before you're going to be complete blown out of power, which is what I ran into a few times there. But realistically, in content, you don't have that kind of an issue. So if you can stay mid-range, you can still do really good damage. 47k from mid-range is still very good for light, considering it's just 1 power spam. You're just doing random whip spam. You do have to account for whips moving you forward, so making sure if it's like elite content or something you're doing where you don't want to be in melee range for splash damage or anything like that from an NPC. Make sure that you're positioning yourself so you can, like the way I did it was I'm constantly moving backward, and then my whips is bringing me forward. As you saw doing that rotation. So it's just how you position yourselves. It's going to be different on a controller or a gamepad or whatever you do, but you just account for that moving forward with whips and keeping that under control, and then a consistent power, and you've got a decent rotation for mid-range where you don't have to be melee the entire time. And it's just using 1 power, so it frees up a lot of options. Like you don't necessarily have to do the Chompers Clip. You could do in Trap Clip. In Trap, crits are very similar to Sonic Cry. In Trap would be max range. You just have to worry about throwing the ads all over the place, encasing the ads. But you've got some options available to you, or you've got the Supercharge Spam from Neo Venom and a 25%er. Just matters. Speed Drain, Supercharge, or Devastating Flip, or Vacuum Bubble, or even the iconic Supercharge you could use, Pheromone Bloom. So just another running at 25%er plus Neo Venom just to account for that Eye of the Gemini spam. Okay, so on to the light controlling side. Light controlling itself hasn't changed from my previous guide. It's light controlling has been the same since Stats Revamp. The controller meta has kind of shifted. It just depends on how much money you want to put into your artifacts, which I'll touch on in a moment. But light controlling itself hasn't changed. Unfortunately, light controlling, the deficiencies of the power set still remain. Compared to the other controller power sets, it has no advantages. It only has disadvantages. So it's one of those powers where if you're looking for like a pure controller class, it's not the most ideal for that. And what I mean by that is, lightweight strike is the attack debuff, which is not ideal. I'd rather see it be a defense debuff. It also has a really weak crowd control effect. It's just a knockdown, which is not ideal either. You want kind of a stun or not ideally in a case, but you definitely want a stun. Light Blast is the only defense. It's the only debuff power that's a finisher, which means that it's you cannot be clipped because it's a channel. Whip Thrash does apply debuff as well, but unless you're in melee or mid-range, you're not going to get any supercharge regeneration, which is obviously a huge issue. You can't just be using a power that just applies debuff and does no damage and no generation. Then you're just costing yourself a useless power. Snap Trap itself is a single target stun. It's not mass stun, so it's not ideal once again for that. Light Barrier is the only controller shield that doesn't drop aggro, so if you're going for res, doesn't matter. If you're getting hit by an ads and you pop Light Barrier to try to get a res, the ads are going to keep attacking you, unlike Distract or Grandeur or Quantum Telling. So it's just coupled all together, it just has no advantages, unfortunately, which is a shame. It's just that compared to the others. So we kind of get into the spec here. Myself, I'm always going to be speccing hybrid. I've touched on that in previous videos. It's just, unless you don't want to use your weapons at all, then go super powered, but hybrid is the most efficient way to control. Obviously, it's going to be maxing out critical power chance and critical power magnitude. This is where I kind of slightly differ, and this will depend on your skill point spec as well, but the previous DLC was at 235 the max, because each DLC goes up at 10 skill points. I was at a position where I didn't need any more power with I've got my Kryptonian Soda on cooldown, I've got for the rest of my rotation, my supercharge regeneration and stuff like that, so I don't need to put another 10 skill points into might and power. It's just unnecessary, so then I just put more into Vit. So it kind of reached that sweet spot where you're at 235 skill points into might and power. That's enough power pool to maintain your clipping rotation, especially light, because you can't clip it fast enough with Light Blast. So you can afford to put more into Vit. In terms of, once again, in terms of loadout, obviously we just touched on that. Lightweight Strike, Recharge, Light Blast, Snap Trap, Light Barrier, and Group Shielding will be the loadout you want to run for that. In terms of gear, the weapon's always going to have Replenishing Adapter. Head mod's going to have Supercharged Group Shielding. Neck mod's going to be Replenishing Procs. Back mod doesn't really matter for controlling. Chest mod's going to be Power Efficiency always. Leg mod, once again, doesn't matter. The healing doesn't scale anymore, so there's no point. Hand mod's always going to be max damage. Foot mod doesn't really matter as well. I use Tumbling Mastery just for some better rolls. In terms of affinity mod bonuses, this is just depending on what you want to do. You could do, if you're primarily DPS, and you would take a might and might. But if you want to be more of a primary controller, then you would take Vit and Vit. But your Type C and Type D are always going to be debuff efficiency and power strategist. Power strategist doesn't really matter. Don't worry about that. But the Type C mod is still very helpful for controlling. In terms of good trinkets, doesn't really matter. Once again, the Summer Event trinket gives you a little bit of power return, and it's 246 Vit, so it's nice. Or you could run like just a regular DPS trinket. You've got the controller trinket, Orbital and Supply Drop. You could run the Central City trinket as well, or Sidekick for a bit of power. In terms of artifacts, this is where I was talking about where the meta has slightly changed. They changed the Tetra and the Cog to allow, so basically before it didn't double unless you're in damage roll, but now this effect is doubled in damage roll or controller roll. So this turns controllers more into like a buff controller. So say you're running a raid and there's a bunch of might DPS, well, you don't necessarily need the Parasite then, or you don't necessarily need the Amulet just for the extra debuffs, because it's not as noticed. So then you could run the Tetra. So you're basically buffing all the DPS's might. You're running the Parasite, running the Scrap Soul Cloak. Same thing. If it's all Prec DPS, you could run the Cog. If you're running all Prec DPS and they don't really need power, you could run the Claw. And then the Claw basically at 200 gives the 5% extra critical chance and critical magnitude for all the rolls. So that's nice as well. So it just depends. The meta has kind of shifted to controllers giving power, because there's so many Prec DPS now that don't really need power, so the meta has kind of shifted to being a buff controller, so being not so much a battle troll, but more like a buff troll doing some damage, because the Claw helps to do some damage as well. But that's where the meta kind of falls, but the meta is entirely with artifacts. There's nothing you can do with your loadout or spec or anything like that. It's completely based around artifacts. So that's what I was saying. Unless the Claw is only good at 160 if you're doing raids, because at 120 it only affects 3 people, so that's pointless for a raid. The Tetra and Cog, you could keep at 120, but the Claw is only good at 160 or 200, ideally at 200. So it gets very expensive to do this. That's why it's not for every controller. But if you want to, depending on what your group needs, your league needs, such like that. But if you want to be a buff troll, it's completely with artifacts. There's nothing else with your spec that you can do for that. So in terms of rotation, the only thing you have to remember for Light Blast is that, Light Blast, yes, it's a good stun, but you have to, once you cancel out of Light Blast, you lose that stun. So basically you'd have to sit in the channel the entire time, which is not ideal. And you can't clip out of it. So if I do Light Blast with recharge, not going to work until the end. So what you do by that is you jump cancel it. So Light Blast, jump or move forward a bit, canceled out of it. So in terms of an actual rotation, Solar Flame, Light Blast, and basically you just skip the recharge. That's all it is. So normally you do Light Blast, clip with recharge, and you just skip it. And now I've got some pets here to watch me control. But yeah, that's essentially, normally any other controller rotation, you would clip your defense debuff or clip your debuff with recharge to get back into the rotation. You just can't do that with light, so you basically just skip it. So, like I said before, first debuff, just let Light Blast run, and third. So I've got all my debuffs applied. I still got a little bit of supercharge generation. You can always let it hang if you need the stun. It's just one of those awkward powers. Yeah, it's a super good stun, but you don't want to just sit there and Light Blast the entire time. That's not practical. You're costing yourself power generation. But if the group doesn't need power and the tank needs a stun or something like that, then you can do that, because Snap Trap's not going to really do anything. It's a single target stun, and Lightweight Strike is just a knockdown, which again is useless. So Light Blast, you're kind of stuck as your only stun ability. So it just depends on the situation, but that's it in terms of what it does. So just Light Blast, jump cancel, and it cancels it there. Or you let it hang a little bit, same thing. Let it hang, and then jump cancel it, whichever you want to do. On PC it's a little different, because I can just do it and kind of move forward and it cancels it. It'll be a little bit different for you're on the PS controller, but basically here you just kind of make a little bit of movement and cancel straight out of it. So you can still clip out of it fairly quickly, but it just kind of, your mileage may vary. But that's controlling.